Ditha hadina pabuni, the bocasto MESKLA Brewyon Drudh, Ostis Genev Sove Berryman. Hello and welcome everyone to the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcasts, hosted by me, Sove Berryman. MESKLA Brewyon Drudh is a multi-platform project using sculpture making and conversation to explore contemporary Cornish cultural identity. Through workshops, podcasts, a symposium and an exhibition, the project invites people to share their experiences of identity and Cornwall, and their views on Cornish culture and its relationship to land, language, heritage, tourism, the Cornish diaspora and much, much more. These podcasts record conversations with guests whose research or lived experience touches on the project themes. The views, thoughts and opinions expressed are the speaker's own. All conversations are carried out with a spirit of generosity and openness, creating space for the discussions to twist and turn. And I'm very grateful to all who have taken part. In this 7th podcast, I'm joined by artists Kayle Brandon and Angela Piccini of Association of Unknown Shores. Association of Unknown Shores formed in 2018. It is an interdisciplinary social practice art project and platform for the research, production and commissioning of art and cultural works. The project explores the hidden nature of persistent material and remembered traces of the enforced cultural exchange between what we now know as the UK and Canada, working with the legacies of Martin Frobisher's 16th century attempt to colonise Nunavut. A collective of diasporic artists, Association of Unknown Shores turns the unknown back on itself to critique the worn colonial discovery trope. We join the conversation with Kayle telling us about the origins of Association of Unknown Shores. Govenek and beus, the omlowenhe goslowes orto. I hope you enjoy listening.
Association of Unknown Shores began because I was one project in relation to exploring Bristol and exploring ways of having a meaningful relationship with the places of Bristol was called Avon Canoe Pilot, which was in collaboration with Heath Bunting. This took place in 2000 somewhere. And we decided to explore the river and waterways of Bristol as total rookies, as people who didn't know the water, as somebody who didn't even know how to canoe or navigate water systems. So it was very much about being, a lot of my work is very much about being an amateur, about being DIY, about gaining access to knowledge and experiences through an embodied, self-generative community empowerment process of just trying to make things happen to the scale in which we can. And so I found out about this story through my explorations of the Bristol waterways all that time ago, a couple of decades ago. And the story was of how an Inuit man undertook a hunting event with his kayak and his bows and shot ducks within the centre of Bristol, and that utterly kind of compelled me to find out more. It just seemed kind of like, so it was just this insight that I wanted to know more. And through researching, it became obvious that this was a very significant moment and too big a situation to explore by myself. And it just occurred to me that I kind of wanted to work with Angela, significantly around her own heritages and experiences of the city and how she works, but also because we hadn't collaborated before, and I just kind of got a sense that would be really interesting to work together on this. So that's how it started. A conversation at Angela's house has now led to what we call Association of Unknown Shores, a platform that's been very process led and careful in its making, collapsing and reforming as we go along, and very much socially led. So a lot of Association of Unknown Shores, that we're producing a body of objects. There is this other work that's going on under it, which is more like the mycelium of the project, which is generated through conversations, working with others, meeting difficult questions, wayfinding, making mistakes, picking ourselves up again, dropping threads, finding them again, all that kind of stuff that's led us to this very interesting point in time.
Yeah, so I really love hearing Kayle tell those origin stories in different ways and how they shift and change through our project as well. And I think from my perspective, having lived in Bristol from 96 to 2021 and always sort of running across, Kayle and I, our paths sort of crossed over in so many different ways through the city over that period of time. So I was really, really incredibly happy and excited when Kayle talked to me about this history and asked if I wanted to do some work with her on it. And I think the other aspect of it is I'm originally from Canada, from Western Canada, but first generation of immigrant parents. So I'm from a settler colonial nation with very little in the way of time-based roots in Canada. And I'm part of a settler colonial complex. And I think for me, what was really interesting is that I'd heard of Frobisher in terms of like Frobisher's lemonade, or in a Canadian context, Frobisher Bay, which is what the capital city of Nunavut in northern Canada was called. It's now called Iqaluit, which is the place of many fishes. But it was named Frobisher Bay by Martin Frobisher. But I'd never been taught that history when I was going to school in Canada. So to come to the UK to learn the relationship between the privateers, Queen Elizabeth I, the sort of nexus of Elizabethan magic, theft, fraud, political chicanery, and the origins of colonization was really just a really interesting opportunity and a lot of responsibility to hold. And it felt like that was a thing that I wanted to do to do the research around this project. So my own practice, I have a real interest in how we can activate the material traces of the past and the present, how we can think about archives and artifacts as radical time traveling objects that, depending on how you handle them and depending on how you reposition them and juxtapose them, collage them, can potentially create new futures and myriad new futures. And so how you handle these works, it comes with obviously huge weight, because whatever you do with an object and a trace will foreclose some futures while opening up other futures. So what do we do with this? And it became really interesting for me as well. How do we hold this story, which sits at an intersection of various different people? So the Inuit of northern, what's now known as Canada, and these thieves from England, but also ordinary people. So the story of Frobisher's journey to northern Canada, you know, he's press ganging free miners and Cornish miners. So basically forcing labouring men to be part of his crew to go and oppress other people in another part of the world. And me and Kayle have, obviously, we are connected to these stories through our own personal legacies, but we don't have direct descendancy from any of those communities. And yet we also want to speak to and speak back at and speak into and make work that sits within and messes colonization up in some way. So it was that sense of, okay, so where do we go from here? What do we do with this history? What are appropriate ways of working with these materials and of speaking with and working alongside and collaborating with people who are from those descent communities, whether those are the descent communities of the free miners in the Forest of Dean or the descent communities of people who currently live in Iqaluit, which is a thriving city of 2,000 to 3,000 people in the far north.
Thank you. There's so much just in both what both of you have said there. There's so much that I'm sort of just full of processing all the layers of that as well. A thing that really comes across in initially in some of that is the way you speak about the project and your work in the project from a perspective of taking time, paying attention, wayfinding, and it feels like that approach or that way of making work and about exploring your way through this subject matter is absolutely essential and integral to it. When you think about that, the way you approach the project, is that a strategy you developed, or is it something that just naturally evolved? Like, did you set out on the project with that in mind, that way of working in mind?
Well, we knew we needed to work with people, Inuit communities that this story directly related to and it affected, and also work directly with the remains of the story, which there are many. I essentially feel like I'm a landless person with no Indigenous. I have an Indigenous heritage in a kind of very actually, maybe I can't even answer that question. So I have a very kind of complicated relationship to belonging, which has come about through my kind of dual heritages and ancestral stories that have led to my kind of personal identity. I think some of those intentions, like wayfinding, working with others, conversation, has very much, I think I can be fair to say, it's been both part of our practices for a long time. This project definitely taught me and developed the core kind of that this is a really essentially really interesting way of working and essential way of working when we're dealing with the impacts, the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonization and coloniality, which once you start working with it, it's just riddled, like Bristol is riddled, and with ongoing kind of colonial structures that perpetuate that kind of form of reality and relation to land and people. So we're dealing with really kind of a kind of systematic approach, colonization, which is devastating, traumatic, and ongoing. So we knew also that we had to kind of really sort of just strip back and kind of find out through talking and working with these different remains in a way that kind of we would be led rather than leading, because obviously that was a kind of ethically a really important standpoint. When in fact we even and there's some moments along the way that's really challenged our identities and our kind of ethical working relationships and what authenticity is, and where we can even speak from, where we can even make from. Where do we make from? Where do we speak from? What can we hold, and what is for others? To actually lead on. Very, very core, important ways of working with communities where trust around has been eroded through the impacts of colonization. So, when going back to that kind of mycelium network, kind of working with objects that generate conversations, I think in some ways those conversations are one of the most important legacy of this work. We went to Iqaluit, and that was an amazing achievement to get there. So I think when we met Janet Pitzulak-Brewster, she actually said, listen, the sound of your voice, my voice she was referring to, is actually going to be potentially a trigger for many people here. And then, because of very kind of British, middle of the road accent, that still has a kind of traumatic effect on people that have been on the receiving end of colonization. So there was these kind of moments of kind of like, oh right, I'm kind of like, what is my cultural the identity that I'm born into, the country, the word, what's the actual impact and implication for other people? How do we work with this? This is not ours. How do we work with this story? Where do we stand from? So lots of the approaches were very much developed through that, having to be careful and wanting, not having to be, wanting, really wanting, and wanting that to be more important than what necessarily gets, what the result is necessarily, actually, at the end of the day.
And having to be okay with that care not always landing. So I think one of the key parts of learning, of working with the people that we've been working with, that sense of just because you're caring and attending and doing things mindfully and well doesn't mean that you'll get a response. And I think learning different modes of response, different modes of attention, to the extent to which, what we do might be irrelevant to people at certain points in time, and learning to be okay with that has also been part of that process, which has meant that we both have had to shift the ways in which we might have worked previously. So it's learning new practices in that way.
One really interesting experience we had with one of the objects was some of the ore that was mined, taken from Colonial Island, is wound up in Dartford, in a wall in Dartford that's currently framing a kind of modern shopping experience of like Asda and B&Q and Pizza Hut. And anyway, so we went there, and some of this ancient stone that was mined in the 16th century, 1570 78, 3 miners mined that up in Colonial Island, forgive me if my pronunciation is off. Not good. So actually, a lot of the work is actually being in the place, going to experience the remains in a kind of very physical way, where we don't quite know what's going to happen, but something's going to happen. And one of the stones, a few of the stones have fallen out of that wall, and one of them was just next to a car, and it was just this moment, just like, okay, we're going to take these stones that were mined 1578. And we ended up carrying one of them back to Iqaluit and handing it eventually to Janet Pitchelack-Brewster. And we didn't really know the significance of that. But slowly the stone got heavier on our backs, and more we'd get it out and hand it around kind of cafes and restaurants and talk to people about the story of why we got stone in our bag. And that was a way of dispersing the story and dispersing kind of the practices and the current dilemmas that we're kind of questioning through that. So I feel like your work, this way that the stone acted as a focus for us to kind of generate conversations. And then there was this amazing moment where we handed it to Janet. And also through that kind of carrying of the stone, we realized, oh, this is actually falling into a performative realm. This is falling into a kind of quite a sort of indie repatriation kind of process. This is falling into women's hands where it's all been in male hands before. This is, so we kind of, it gathered momentum and meaning as we kind of went along. And then when we actually handed it to Janet, and it was like, oh wow, this is quite significant. This is the first time this stone has returned back to the land of its belonging for how many 500 years, 600 years, and it came through our rucksacks and our hands and our sort of meetings and our kind of just having to lug it about places. And so that felt really like we learned through engaging with the object in that way, the remain of that object in that way, and continue to. So now that stone appeared in really significant work by Lackalup Barthé Williamson and Jamie Griffiths, where they created this image. I don't know the title of that work. Do you know the title of their work, Angela?
It's called The Known Shore. White
Liar.
White Liar and The Known Shore.
So, is there a link to that through your project website?
No, not yet, but we've got to just sort our website out. We haven't done that all yet, but it will be.
Great, yeah, it'd be. I'll try and share that. That'd be fab. Thanks.
So through going there, we met Jamie and told this story of Frobisher, and she had this persona called White Liar already through other work. She's been exploring that kind of White Liar identity, and then went on to create a White Liar costume based on Frobisher, and then they produced this kind of image which had like Lackalup kind of referencing the Queen, Elizabeth I, and then it's just, just need to see it really. But the stone was within that. So then they went and collected the stone from Janet. Janet left it in a shoe for them to pick up. It got taken out of the shoe, got put into that shot. So it's just like amazing to see what can happen, like the ongoing legacy of our kind of spontaneous and like improvised decision making that we had, was just like, oh, should we take it? Yeah, let's go for it. And now what should we do? And now what should we do? And that's what I'm sort of still amazed by that.
And I think, so I was just going to say, I think what's so interesting about that particular rock as well is that it ties us back into those debates about land without having to be landlocked in some way, because that chunk of land has moved around the world now several times. And then, so Jamie Griffiths is a white English artist who lives up in Iqaluit, and Lakuluk Williamson Bathory is a Greenlandic Inuk artist who also lives in Iqaluit. So they collaborate. They then made this sort of tableau photograph, which was then turned into a large sort of billboard, which was installed in a park in Vancouver, which is where I'm from, which is in Kitsilano. And the importance of doing that is because that part of Western Canada remains unceded Indigenous land. So that part of Canada never went through any form of treaty process. So the Crown effectively stole that land from the Indigenous nations who occupied it. So that's the import of installing that photographic work in Vancouver, in a part of Vancouver called Kitsilano, which is named after Chief Kitsilano. So that rock from Nunavut, which went off to Dartford, which then went back to Nunavut, which then went to Vancouver to say something really profound about land and ownership and control. And there is no ownership. So I think what's also interesting between that relationship between the unceded territory of Vancouver and then in Nunavut in northern Canada is the word Nuna means land, and Inuit, they don't have the same kind of treaty territory process as other Indigenous people in Canada. So it's more of a shared whole territory that's marked by settlement, hunting, gathering, and different kinds. So there's not that same sense of land ownership and exchanging of land as packet through Inuit communities.
Frobisher also took a narwhal horn on the first. So Frobisher basically, I don't know, like maybe listeners won't know, but Frobisher was the first person commissioned by the Crown, Elizabeth I, 15. My dates are all over the place. The first trip, maybe it was 1568. Anyway, he was commissioned to break through the Northwest Passage. And also the sailors were informed by John Dee, who was very important to Elizabeth I, about navigation, about what to find, how to record. John Dee had really explored Columbus's journals. So there was, and then John Dee, they say, through this around about the same time. I don't know how true this is, but I loved it when I was given this information. I was like in a vegetable shop, hanging out with a friend, told him about this, about John Dee, and he said, "Oh yeah, apparently John Dee was the person that named British Empire and did a ritual to evoke British Empire. Whether it's true or not, who knows? But just the information, that kind of visual kind of like, oh wow, right." And it was around about the same time. So if you kind of like research John Dee, he was significantly involved in this story. And the narwhal horn that Frobisher took, same time as this piece of rock that decided to have gold in it, which didn't have gold in it at all, which was the first gold mining fraud of the Americas. At the same time, Frobisher, when he landed in Bristol, rode to Windsor and gave this narwhal horn that was recorded in George Brast's journal, because basically when they found it, they did this test on whether it had magical powers. So the sailors did a test on whether it had magical powers by putting some spiders in the hole at the end. And the spiders presently died, and therefore it was magical. And it's just this really, George Best records, there's very in-depth accounts of this story, obviously through the lens of his beingness within it, which was a kind of privileged position. The sailors are silent. There's no voices from them. There's no songs from them. The miners are silent. There's no song. We don't know what their songs, what their stories were at all. Obviously, we know the higher ranked kind of people on that journey, exploitation journey. And so anyway, so then in relation to going back to kind of talking about how we kind of experienced that story and that object, the narwhal horn, because the narwhal horn was placed into Elizabeth I's crown jewels. It was that kind of, it was one of the most wealthy things you could have, and all the royalty of Europe had some form of narwhal relationship. The narwhal horn was about protection, about power, about potency, about all sorts of things. It was ingested to protect from poisoning. It was held as symbols of power. It was used as, all sorts of kind of magic evoking. So basically, Angela and I were like, okay, there was this company on eBay who sold replica narwhal horns. We brought one, broke along the way, arrived at my house, broken into. So then we got in touch with Lisa Scantlebury, really artist, model maker based at Spike Island. And then she kind of fixed it, and then we went and then we decided to recast the narwhal horn as forms of kind of magic remaking, recasting, recast it and then pushed it back out onto eBay as an object that people could buy. So it's this kind of like shady, kind of like, little sort of eBay run, recasting, re kind of monetarizing. But then we kind of did it in this way where we wanted to work with Kadjifut Society, a performing arts group based in Kayle, who we met many of the performing artists and the directors of that group, and they're currently trying to set up a performing arts centre, and there's big fundraising. So then we decided, we had this kind of real sort of noodle around how much would we kind of like sell this narwhal horn for, and we ended up with £77.98. We were trying to do something around dates and something around, I don't know, just mucking around really. And to our surprise, people brought it endlessly. And we're just like, oh my God, someone's brought the narwhal horn, okay? And, so at the moment the site's down, but demand this replica narwhal horn is quite high. At the same time, it enabled us to then siphon money off from that sale to Kadjifut Society. So then the people that brought the narwhal horn would also get a certificate showing that the money that they used for the narwhal horns gone towards this art centre. So we liked that kind of knotty, kind of weird. And then we wrapped round just like a Xerox copy of George Best's account of this magical test that the sailors did. Just wrapped it round it with plastic elastic band around it so people could read that. And then we had some suggestions on how it could be used. And recasting the narwhal horn came another object called our sceptre. Or maybe I'll pass over to Angela to talk about that.
What we really liked was how these contemporary exchanges related to these histories. So that sense of certification, so which spoke to the sort of shareholders of the Northwest Passage, the Cathays company that was set up to go on this colonial expedition from 1576 to 78. There were shareholders, they were defrauded, they received certificates which were inauthentic. All of these sort of different sorts of stories of truthful things and false things, all rendered fictional through these kind of weird, magical, scientific relationships. So I think that's what we're always keeping in mind when we're doing this kind of work, which is what connects it with this next piece of our sceptre, where we were starting to work more regularly with. So we've mentioned Janet Piccini-Brewster before. So she was the artistic or executive director of the Nunavut Arts and Crafts Association. And then she became deputy mayor of Iqaluit. And she's now recently been elected as an MLA, so a member of the Legislative Assembly for Nunavut. So she's gone from being an artist to being a politician while always being politically active as an artist. So she makes cast wax heads of women, particularly to comment on and to intervene in missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. So she'll take these heads to different kinds of political meetings in order to presence the lives of these women to call for action. So we're working more with her. And then Kayle was saying, we should be working with Cleo Lake, who's the Deputy Lord Mayor of Bristol for her period of time. I can't remember where that started and stopped, but in the late 2010s, sort of 2015 to 18, something like that. And she's also an artist. So she's a choreographer. She works with textiles. She has mixed heritage Ghanaian and British, I believe. So there's that similar. So here we are faced in this kind of serendipitous position of working with all these women of mixed heritage. So Janet Piccini-Brewster is her grandfather, I think, was Scottish. So she's also got this slightly uneasy or a set of relationships that she's also having to work through. And then in this intersection between politics and arts, which is like magic and arts. And so we got together and through a series of Zoom meetings, we started to work on, well, what would it be to collaborate, the four of us, to make an object that could potentially catalyze new shore-to-shore relations? What would a kind of speculative future, anti-racist, decolonial, feminist object look like that we could make, in the knowledge that, of course, all of those things are also impossible? The four of us can't decolonize the world. We will continue to struggle with all sorts of complex issues around racism and oppression and discrimination. I think what, Kayle, you were talking about with language and the sound of language is so interesting. How, Kayle, you were sort of seen as a colonial oppressor. And my voice is heard by people in Canada as English. So, Janet was saying, both of you sound English, which is just, if to a person in Britain, would sound crazy that I would sound English, but that's how I'm read. So there's just all these, it's code switching, it's unstable ground, and that's the sort of the place that we're occupying. So using the narwhal horn as the starting point, then what were the kinds of objects or actions that each of the four of us could contribute that would then connect with this narwhal horn? So we're going to be creating different sort of connector objects that would tie in these different material objects, basically to create a five sectioned scepter, like you have a scepter to open Parliament. So off the narwhal horn will be four different objects. Mine involves sort of making basketry out of videotape. So with my interest in moving image and my interest in sort of in early documentary, this part of the world was the site of one of the earliest documentaries, so Robert Flaherty's Nunavut of the North. And Canada's Indigenous people have been the subject of so many documentaries throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I was interested in working with film and videotape as a material around that, and thinking through basketry as well. Kayle, what was your...
Yeah, I just got really into the eye of the needle, the idea of the needle eye, and how it sort of symbolizes so many different kind of things for me, like, the kind of typical saying, getting through the eye of the needle, and essentially women's practices of making, practices that almost are ubiquitous. So they kind of translate and transcend a lot of differences. Obviously differences within that, but there was a place to meet through the eye of the needle. That's what I was like riffing on. So yeah, that was, and I mean the idea of making this collaborative sculpture, object work, our scepter, and it being 5-pointed, the chaos of that making has been like fascinating. And it's still ongoing. I mean, we're kind of like at a standstill, I'd say, but we'll see what comes out the other end. So this idea of kind of like this speculative future, kind of, it's almost like, for me, it's almost like a science fiction object. Or it's an object of hope as well. And also it's a very practical object. It symbolises working practices and current kind of political structures that hold and have many voices holding the seats of power, which is a very kind of every daily life kind of piece in a way. But it's a 5-piece because there's 4 of us, all quite diverse in our practicing, in our practices, and our making sensibilities. And then there's the non-human, the narwhal, the voice that, you know, the voice of the narwhal, which is obviously very core and essential to it as well.
Janet's going to be contributing one of her cast heads to this, and also pieces of treated Arctic char skin. So Janet works with the different materials of the far north, one of which is the skin of an Arctic char, which is a bit like a salmon, and you can cure it and turn it into a kind of leather, and she colors it and all sorts. So that's going to be woven into it. And then Cleo is contributing choreography. So we're also really interested in, and we have been inviting instructions from collaborators. So in terms of what do we do with this scepter, Cleo's sort of starting us off with a series of movements and actions that we can do with the scepter, both here in the UK, but then eventually sending that over to Iqaluit so that we can mirror actions across the two on the two shores.
You mentioned a bit earlier on about having worked with some people in the Forest of Dean, and I'm interested in how the work was sort of engaged with or not there, or what came up from that.
Yeah, so we got in touch with Elaine Moorman, found out she was the only registered or free miner. And Jonathan.
Can you explain briefly just what a free miner is, please?
Yeah, so I'll do my best. I don't have the full kind of, but yeah, I'll do my best. So the free miner, so I can't remember when the Three Miners kind of decree took place, but it's a kind of status that anybody born within a certain radius of the Forest of Dean has a right to mine minerals and earth resources from the land. And any man of a certain age had that right to be named as a free miner and to mine the land within the home of the Forest of Dean. So it's incredibly interesting, and I haven't explained it in depth enough. Please go and find out more. So we were fascinated by this status of the free miner, especially in relation to how much independence they had in quite an oppressive sort of regime, really. And that originally, I think 9 or 12 free miners went from the Forest of Dean on this voyage to the Arctic, to Nunavut, to Colonial, and all survived, came back to the Forest of Dean, continued with their practices. Still unknown, we don't know who their ancestors are or anything, but with a bit of digging around, I'm sure we'd find out. So we were initially moved by this and also wanted to kind of contact the free mining community. So I, after researching, I found out that women were given the right to become formally recognised as free miners. Women, children, families, men, women, and children were all miners. It was just like this kind of certificate that held the kind of male miner as the one that had this status in a formal manner. So we managed to find Elaine and emailed her, and then through that she told us to get in touch with Jonathan Wright, her brother, at Clearwell Caves. And this cave, mining cave, has been in their family for generations. So Elaine told us this amazing story that she can remember. One of her earliest memories is of being lowered by a bucket into the mine and picking stuff up and mining. So it's just like, oh wow, that's just epic and totally interesting. So we went to see them, and it was quite interesting the conversation that we had, because there was lots of like they didn't know stuff that we knew. We didn't know, obviously, which was quite interesting. Almost taking some of their kind of story back and saying, look, this is what happened, and I think Jonathan might actually go on to kind of make that more specific on the Clearwell Cave website. But Elaine, basically, we spent a day with her, told the story in a very sort of over a cup of tea sandwich kind of way, which we hope that she will then come to Bristol and see the work. And there's other things that are going to develop from that. Currently, the last thing that happened was she sent a picture of her pickaxe, which is just stunning. So it's the pickaxe that she's always worked with. And she told us this process of trying to become formally recognised as a female in the free mining. So and she said that she got through the wording because it stated any free miner should be male. So then that was this amazing kind of through that. It's like, oh wow. So she's just like, yeah, I could have not wasted so much time because I could have used this wording as a way to get through. But then her brother told me, actually, no, it's not like that. So it was all this kind of like back toing and throwing, but through that an object, I produced this brick, but she hasn't seen. Has she seen it? No, I sent her a picture of it that is embroidered the word should on it. It's a bit like a prayer stool, but it's brick. Can you remember like embroidery, tapestry that was wrapped around bricks to keep doors open? I've got this kind of weird memory of childhood, funny practice of tapestry wrapped around bricks for doors to be opened with. So that's what came out of that, this object, this tapestry brick that's got the word should. And I was fascinated by this word should because it was a bit like an eye of a needle. It just kind of like get through. So yeah, so that was this kind of ongoing conversation. And I'm not really sure. I mean, Elaine turned out mined earth pigments, ochres, so purple, yellow, and red. And she told us this amazing story of one of her largest commission was from the British Army for the tanks going out to the east. She provided the earth pigments for those tanks to be painted. That was just like, oh, that's just mental. And why earth? I mean, like so specific to like, I was just like, wow, that's just so strange. How our work was received so far, I think they were really pleased that we took the time to come and really kind of find out. And we want to kind of go on to make a kind of portrait of Elaine's pickaxe because she's retired now, and this was her tool. It's really significant tool. And then Jonathan, when we went to see the Clearwell Caves, got all his kind of objects out, and one of them was this amazing hat that had been found down in the mine. and it was so beautiful. It was paper thin. It was like holding an eggshell, but it was this really old felt hat, like miner's hat. But then he was really interested in the Monmouth cap that Angela has been making in relation to, which is entangled in so many histories, the Monmouth cap. So I think that so far curiosity. Our work's been received with curiosity, and I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next when hopefully we can. And generosity, Elaine was very generous with her time. We talked about certain things we had no idea about. We went back to find out about the basket. So this is another object, which has just recently been developed through a basket maker, Nora Kennedy, who's in Stroud. But the basket, a free miner's basket, was found on Colonial Island in the permafrost. And it turned out that Angela, one of Angela's friends during her student days, was one of the people that excavated it. So what was her name? Sorry.
So Alison Bain. So I met Alison Bain in Sheffield when I did an MA in archaeology, and she was doing an MSc. She's also from Canada, and we met in Sheffield. And then she went back to Canada. And the next thing I heard was in this project that she was one of the excavators on Colonial Island who had actually uncovered this basket. So I think it's also why this story is really, it's so tentacular. It's a really difficult story to tell because there are so many complex intersections and serendipities. But like the story itself in the past, it also mixes magic and science and art because all these things happen as though they were ordained, as though we're sitting within some kind of science fiction story. And it also, every time we sort of try to tell the story of just one object, it goes out in so many different directions, which of course is the same for any object biography, whether you're telling the story of a frisbee or anything else. But I think the project, what we're trying to manifest are these sort of deep time intersections and those global connections, and how the specificities of like a basket or a bit of ochre in the Forest of Dean connects us with these much broader processes and relationships.
I wonder, just thinking about those, like you say, the sort of the magics, and if we include science practices within sort of magic, that that a bit like the way you were speaking about the narwhal horn, is those sort of magics become a sort of fetish that further controls and is a vehicle for maintaining power or for shifting balances of power. And it feels like there's something in what you're doing that is also kind of moving around, blowing away some of the smoke and moving away some of the mirrors, that to reveal some truths, if that's quite a heavy word, but some truths behind things that have been interpreted as sort of magics and wonders. What would you think about in relation to that?
Well, speaking for myself, I can definitely say that this project has revealed to me a lot of the places of Bristol and the connections that I didn't know of before, and the ways of relating that can actually form something meaningful on my terms, not on, obviously we've got meaningful different ways of feeling meaning and belonging. So I think it's revealed a kind of belongingness through this practice that, and then within the kind of realm of the Association of Unknown Shores, which has incorporated many artists and talked to many people, I feel as if it has revealed different kind of moments of how we relate to each other and the places in which we are. I don't know how far that will translate. It'll be interesting to see how it translates for the audiences that see the work at St Stephen's Church in November in Plymouth, the Plymouth Arts Centre later in early next year. It certainly has revealed much of the way in which I want beneficial ways of kind of approaching art practice and daily life on my scale of community. And I think it also, I mean, I'd like to also talk about another object, like the feather, a feather from Jamie Griffiths's hat as White Lyre, as Frobisher White Lyre. She sent that to us and it arrived in the post. And I was like, oh, I want to open this at this local cafe that I haven't been in ever before. Let's go there. And then my a friend, Eustace, who often comes along with me on our sort of experimental sort of days out, trying to making kind of work in the neighbourhood of Easton. She came along and we went to this cafe called Monte Carlo down in Easton on Stapleton Road to open this package, and wanted to open it somewhere that was public, somewhere where other people could see the package being open, somewhere that was like a kind of a public space that was kind of where people would sort of like could see you if they wanted to or not. You know, I love kind of the incidental witness. That's like a big part of the work, incidental and ways of chaotically dispersing information in this way. It's really been part of it. Through word of mouth, you know, conversation, gossip, new media, and, you know. Anyway, so I went to Monte Carlo and we opened it there, and we sort of like got chatting to the people who own the Monte Carlo cafe. And then one of the guys said, look at that black and white picture of the Monte Carlo cafe on Stapleton Road. And took a closer look at it. It was just above our table. And I realised that the cafe was the Colonial provision store. That was the name of the cafe. It was Colonial provision store.
Wow.
And it was just this amazing photograph that just blew my mind.
Amazing.
And then sent me and Eustace into this kind of like real sort of like the kind of the opening of the feather, the hat, the Colonial provision store, then going up over to what used to be known as Colston Road, which had recently been renamed Toppled Road. I mean, it's just been graffitied on by some residents, but we wanted to go there and kind of significantly mark, and we use the feather as a way of kind of brushing and evoking and caring for these these kind of precarious sites where there's this massive transition out of kind of this, you know, kind of old world into kind of the new sort of renaming, a reclaiming post Colston of these places. So yeah, it was just like in terms of how that affected me in terms of social relevance, it affected the cafe owner because I was like, oh look, we're doing this, and did you know he didn't know. He didn't know the cafe used to be a Colonial provision store. I was just like, just through reading, I was like, did you know that this was this? And then he was like, oh yeah. And now there's this kind of like, oh, let's try to find out about what that was and who. So I hope that I feel like I've received a wealth of kind of relevance through practicing this practice. And I'm really curious to see how the audience might receive relevance through that I don't really know yet, but I know that through distributing and collaborating with other artists, Kathy Hind as well, Kelly J. Jones, Nora Kennedy, who just recently helped me make the basket, so many people, and all this time we are dispersing this story. We're sending it out, and it is creating relevance and kind of work in this quite sort of, well, rhizome-like, mycelium-like kind of manner, which I find exciting.
And in itself seems to have like the ritual magic practices used from a cleansing or remaking perspective.
I mean, this is how it connects with your project survey, really. So there is something about the activation and the event of the live conversation combined with some form of collective making, material making, and that exchange between hands of different kinds of materials, and the specificity of that, how the stone generates a different conversation to the narwhal horn, which generates a different conversation to the feather. There's something about weightiness and the actual material of what we're working with that produces really different relationships and different sorts of possibilities. And it is absolutely that it carries through the conversational mode, but without the objects. That's a different sort of legacy, I suppose, as well. It needs the objects to really generate these new spaces and times. It generates a different quality of a different kind of temporal quality as well, and a different sort of relationship. There is just the holding of a thing and the passing of a thing, of an object from one person to the other, creates that different sense of attention, a different quality of attention.
Do you feel that connects to, for instance, the pickaxe you mentioned and other sort of like the baskets you've spoken about, other forms of hands making that might be more around kind of a utilitarian sort of very purpose focused activity?
We can talk about the hydrophone because it's a very purposed kind of object, but has working with Kathy Hind on making hydrophones for listening to water. Before that, Angela made some hydrophones from YouTube lesson, like we all do. So many lessons on YouTube these days. But that initial first hydrophone thing that we made back in 2018 and 19, 18 developed into us working with Kathy, who's got really worked through her practice, got this deep listening practice in hydrophone making, and it's a really practical object, but so unpractical, like listening to water, and it doesn't have that kind of functioning in daily life thing as something like the pickaxe or the basket has. It's sort of more kind of a sensing object of something quite strange, underwater sounds, sounds of the water, and picking up on sounds that maybe they were the same 500-600 years ago. This is what remains. This is the clear, unending sound that connects that time to now.
I'm just fascinated by everything that you're talking about, and there's so many things that are pinging off in my mind that I'm thinking, I could just blab on for ages now about that, but I won't. And I think what you've really sort of nicely highlighted there is, like, just in what you're saying a moment ago, Kayle, is like there's something about perhaps then the art space in its wider sense that can perhaps allow for this tenuous sort of finding out about something or feeling around something.
Yes, definitely. I mean, it comes into then the money, right? Like, do we have time to find out? Like, do we have the money to find out? And I guess as workers in different fields, we all know that. So I think we have been lucky enough, well, not, not lucky enough, we have managed to secure funding to actually have the time to find out a little bit. And yeah, I just don't want to overly romanticize that, because, like, obviously, time also is a kind of privileged thing in some senses, that we've been able to kind of do this. So that's why I'm really interested in objects that then can generate income, because like more in the world of plumbing, for instance, so your bedrock incomes, how these objects can then be reweaved into current economies, and how we can, through artists, but also through other means, get by through this type of thing. How do we create kind of financial sort of possibilities that enable that finding out time. Anyway, that's going on to another subject. Sorry.
Although it's not, right? It's the same subject, right? We were talking about magic, but practical magic is also about alchemy. It's about transforming labor into other things, which may include money, which allows people to thrive in different ways. And clearly, this small project can't solve any number of things, but we have been generating flows of capital in some interesting ways, and we've yeah. I think which raises questions for the future.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. I'm vastly appreciative.
Thank you.
Miraz.
Miraz.
Miraz, agus goslowes. Thank you for listening. Further episodes of the MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast can be found on my website, soveberryman.co.uk. That's soveberryman.co.uk, where you'll also find guest biographies and a resource page of links to further reading on the topics discussed. If you feel inspired to join the MESKLA conversation about contemporary Cornish cultural identity, please get in touch with me, Sove Berryman, via my website or social media. You'll find MESKLA Brewyon Drudh on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. The MESKLA Brewyon Drudh podcast and project has been made possible due to a wealth of in-kind help and support from many parties, including the Wenda Perrin Festival, Gorseth Cerne, Cornwall Council's Cornish Language Office, Coethus and Yaeth Canuic, Crescent Cerne, Cornwall Neighbourhoods for Change and Falmouth University Falmouth Campus. The project has been supported using public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England, and further funding has been gratefully received from Historic England by Redruth Unlimited. Agus Termin, Agus Quellas. Thank you for your time. See you later.